couple of weeks ago, I was meeting with a teacher of mine, and we were talking about the way things in our world are changing. We were speaking about politics in both the United States and in Israel, and we were acknowledging the reality that opinions are divided on politics in our Jewish communities. And we were joking, because sometimes you just have to laugh, about the difficulties we face in navigating this reality. We ended our joking by acknowledging to one another that most likely neither of us could single-handedly be the downfall of Western civilization, despite our best efforts. Just kidding, just kidding. In all seriousness, it is not easy to take a centrist approach to lead from a moderate perspective in our world as it is today. Of course, we are polarized in so many ways. And one of those ways in which we seem to be polarized is in a contrast between stability and change. Some of us want things to change. The faster, the better. Some of us look to the way things have changed in our lifetimes and say, this is good, but it would be even better if things changed more. And some of us think the changes that have already happened are too much. Some of us look to the way things have changed in our lifetimes and say, this is not the world I grew up in. This is not the world I inherited. This is not the world I want to pass along to my children and grandchildren. In this week's Parasha, we read about activism. We read about a group of people coming together to try to make a significant societal change. Vatikravna benot Zelophehad. The daughters of Zelophehad came forward. The daughters of Zelophehad came before Moses and the whole assembly at the tent of meeting, and they asked for things to be done differently. Essentially, this group of people banded together and stormed the Capitol, so to speak, in protest. Can we learn from this that activism, that trying to make changes in society, is actually something that we see consistently? That the force of change is something that doesn't really change? Now, one of the most contentious issues debated by Jewish leadership today, in case you've missed this whole other topic of debate, is intermarriage, a marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew. We must not allow this, say some rabbis. We must support this, say others. As we know in the conservative movement, the standard is that rabbis and cantors must not officiate at intermarriages, and, depending on one's interpretation, must not even attend a marriage ceremony between a Jew and a non-Jew. But currently, this is hotly debated between colleagues, even colleagues who are in agreement about nearly every other facet of rabbinic practice. I recently read a scholarly analysis of this topic, a rabbinic teshuvah providing analysis and a halachic ruling. And it pointed out that intermarriage has not always been forbidden in Jewish communities. After all, Moses was married to Tzipporah, the daughter of Yitro, a non-Jewish priest. Joseph was married to Osnat, an Egyptian, who was the mother of his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. And back to our Parsha for a moment, the daughters of Zelophehad were Joseph's great-great-great-granddaughters. In these ancient times, Jewish identity was patrilineal. A person was Jewish if their father was Jewish. But as time moved forward, things started to shift. Around 500 years before the Common Era, when Ezra and Nehemiah led the Jewish community, they created a ban on intermarriage. Things had become different in their time. They had been exiled from the land of Israel after the destruction of the first Holy Temple in ancient Jerusalem, and relationships with non-Jews were threatening in a way they hadn't been before. It became a recognized phenomenon in society that Jews would choose to marry non-Jews as a way of leaving the Jewish community. Now, this was not a concern in the times of Moses and Joseph, but times had changed. In this historical context, we shifted our practice of Jewish identity to include matrilineal descent, trying to keep Jews within the Jewish community as much as possible, and continued pressing the prohibition on intermarriage. By the medieval era, the ban on intermarriage was codified by Rambam, who wrote and clarified that a Jewish man cannot cohabit with a non-Jewish woman, and a Jewish woman cannot cohabit with a non-Jewish man. It is only in our times today, our lifetimes, that this ban is now being questioned. So, What's the right thing to do? What's the correct view on intermarriage? Looking back at the course of Jewish history, it seems to be clear. It depends. As times changed, practices changed, and rules changed. These changes led us through the threat of famine in biblical Canaan, out of slavery in Egypt, to the construction of our ancient first and second holy temples, to a 2,000-year exile and back to our dwelling in our promised land. We made it to today, so that proves the success and the correctness of our changing views over time. Doesn't it? It's much easier to take the millennia-long view when we look back, especially when we look back from a place of relative comfort and strength. As threatened as we continue to be in Israel and by anti-Semitism around the globe, we are still much better off than so many of our ancestors. Things have changed over time, but that change has not been our downfall. Now, in our Parasha, when the daughters of Zelophehad came forward, I wonder what was going through the minds of Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly as they made their unprecedented request. "Our father died in the wilderness," was the opening statement of these daughters. They continue and state he was not one of Korach's rebellious band who rebelled against God. Instead, his death was separate from that wrongdoing. The daughters say together, "It's just that our father had no son, and that isn't a good enough reason to deny his descendants an ancestral landholding. Just because he had no son, he doesn't deserve to lose credit for having existed. Let us, the daughters of Zelophehad, say together, inherit on our father's behalf, so that his name is remembered within our family and within our tribe." I wonder how it felt to be sitting in the assembly when these 5 daughters came forward to ask their community, to ask their society for this thing that was so unprecedented. Was the mood in the assembly annoyed, even insulted, as they came face to face with this bizarre and inappropriate request, one that threatened the fabric of their community? Or, perhaps, were there those who sat in the assembly thinking it's about time that someone's brought this up? And of course, I have to imagine there were people in the assembly who were simply distracted by the sight, by the physical appearance of these 5 sisters, Machlah, Noah, Choglah, Milcah, and Tirzah, standing united in public side by side. Did they all look physically similar? Did they all look different, as if they weren't even related? Was one especially odd-looking? Was another especially beautiful? In my imagination, the one person who was taking this all in stride has to have been Moses. After all, he knew what he had to do: inquire of God and receive a response. And of course, that's what Moses did. God responded to Moses, and through Moses, God responded to the daughters of Zelophehad and to the whole community. Not only is the plea of these daughters a just plea, it is a plea that others in our community will surely plead in the future. "So," says God to Moses, "I'm not going to answer just for these daughters here. Instead, I'm going to create a precedent moving forward. So if a man, head of a household, dies without sons, his inheritance will go to his daughters. If he has neither sons nor daughters, his inheritance will go to his brothers. If he has no brothers, his inheritance will go to his paternal uncles. And if he doesn't have any of those, then his inheritance will go to his closest relative." The daughters of Zelophehad made a personal request that was not normal within their community, that was not normal within their society. And what happened was that the definition of normal became different. For some reason, reading this in our Parasha this year surprised me. Maybe I've been listening to the news too much, hearing politicians of various ranks and affiliations make reference to the past, especially the ancient past, as something that exemplifies stability, and as such, should be the source of where today's normal should come from. This year, I needed the reminder that change is constant, that even in the times of Moses, there were requests to the community that we could today call activism, that there were changes to our people's idea of normal, and that those changes were likely received with delight by some and disgust by others. So what was it back in the times of Moses and Eleazar and the chieftains that kept society from coming apart in the face of this changing definition of normal? Well, unfortunately, our Parasha doesn't specifically say. Eleazar and the chieftains didn't have social media accounts to promulgate words of praise or vitriol. If there were journalists who stormed the tent of meeting fighting for footage of the first hot take from an especially mouthy chieftain, we don't have the records of those broadcasts. What our Parasha does say next is that Moses will die. God tells Moses to ascend to the heights of the Abarim and look at the land that God has given to the children of Israel. And God tells Moses that after he does this, he will die. Now, how does Moses respond? He makes a request on behalf of his people for leadership. Moses pleads to God, and Moses pleads with love. He says, "Let God, the source of all breath, appoint someone over the community to take them out and bring them in, so that the community of God will not be like sheep without a shepherd." I hear in this plea an acknowledgement from Moses that the normal of today will not last, that things will continue to change, regardless of what any individual might or might not want. I hear in this plea from Moses an acknowledgement that change is impossible to navigate without leadership, and a desire for his people to have direction and comfort, even when he's no longer there, in the times that normal again becomes upended and the people start wandering like sheep without a shepherd. In order to keep society together as things change, especially as things change in ways that are delightful for some and disgusting for others, we need leadership. And specifically, we need leadership that inspires individuals to continue believing in society itself. The Torah doesn't tell us how people felt about the request of the daughters of Zelophehad. It just tells us that the request of the daughters of Zelophehad was granted. And the Torah also doesn't tell us that society fell apart in the face of this changing definition of normal. The Torah tells us that society continued. And in omitting the hot takes, the opinions, and the hallway conversations that undoubtedly followed Moses' ruling, the Torah tells us that the most important thing is that the ruling was made and accepted. Society itself was preserved, even as what was normal had shifted. As things change in our country, in our world, and in our interpretation of Jewish law, we would do well to remember that change happens. It is not just the political rivals of today that advocate for a redefinition of what is normal. It's also our Jewish ancestors, the great-granddaughters of our patriarch Joseph, that advocate for a redefinition of what is normal, of what is possible. And when we get upset by something an activist says or does, when we stand in opposition to the normal of yesteryear, and when we stand in opposition to the new normal of tomorrow, we must remember, if we can, that there is something even more important than our opinion. It's our belief in society. It's our acceptance of leadership. It's knowing that as a collective, we are better off with a shepherd. We're better off when we don't wander alone. May we continue to believe in society itself, and may our leaders inspire us to continue to trust, not just in them, but in the power and the holiness of our togetherness. Shabbat Shalom.